So here's Mikhail. He runs a company called Lockstep Labs from Thailand. He's from Austria. And he's been a top 15 Ruby contributor on Stack Overflow for a very long time. So big round of applause for Mikhail. And he's going to talk about Sanity on Rails, which I don't know what it means, but let's hear it from him.
Thank you. Okay, well, I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. You're not too full, and the little game woke you up enough so you're awake to listen to me. I also want to say thanks to all the organizers for putting together this wonderful event and having me here. Here's a little introduction, just to make it sure you know who I am and why you're here listening to me. As he already said, my name is Michael, or Michael if you prefer it in English. I'm known as Citizen428 almost everywhere online, from Twitter to GitHub. If you're looking for me, that's me. The username is never taken. That's why I'm sticking to it. I'm currently working as the CTO of Lockstep Labs, which is a medium-sized Rails development workshop in Bangkok, Thailand. We're about 15 to 20 people, partially in the US and partially in Bangkok. I've been developing in Ruby since about 2004 and full-time since about 2008 or 2009. And many of you here will know Satish. I used to work with him on Ruby learning from 2009 to 2012 as a mentor. And I also used to work with Gautam on his book on Ruby and MongoDB development. So I'm very happy to be here and finally meet those guys in person. These are the two states of every software programmer. We alternate between feeling like gods and not knowing at all what we are doing. When we feel like we don't know what we are doing, it's generally because we make our own problems. I've worked with Rails for quite a long time now at different agencies, and the problems that I see are always the same. It's not managing your dependencies well, it's entangling your business logic with the actual framework code. It's an over-reliance on implicit code. The good news is, like the previous speaker already mentioned, all of this is easily avoidable if you pay a bit attention and have some architecture in your Rails app that's on top of what Rails already provides for you. So I'll introduce each of these points with a little story from my actual consulting work. Then we talk about it in a bit more detail and also look at strategies how to avoid this problem for your own projects. Point one, dependencies. So 2 years ago, I was consulting for this very promising startup from London, and they decided to build core of their business logic, which was search related, on a Ruby gem that they found on GitHub. It had a non-trivial C extension, and it was great, as long as it was maintained. The problem is, it was not maintained for very long. We had to fork it, and instead of working on a Rails application, we were suddenly knee-deep in C, and we had to do things we did not plan to do at a point where we didn't have the time for doing it. And this whole experience sums up the whole dependency situation very well. Gems are good for you. I'm not advertising that you ditch them completely and write everything yourself. They help you to bootstrap your application. They stop you from trying to do everything yourself, also known as not invented here syndrome. And every developer has that to a certain degree, because let's be honest, all of us believe that our code is much better than the next guy's. And the main advantage also of gems is they're generally developed in an open way on GitHub. There's discussions, there's peer reviews, and for everything that is security related, this is actually what you want, right? You don't necessarily want to go your own and write your own authentication or authorization. It's much better to have this handled by a group of people, have more eyes on the code. So before you ditch something that is related to security, be very sure you know what you're doing and that you know better than all those people together who work on device. So why do I think dependencies are a problem? Well, as simple as it sounds, they're code you do not control. They may not have the same quality standards, they may not have the same expectations, they may not fit your architecture, they get outdated, their goals may not be aligned with your project, and there's nothing you can do about this, because you do not control this code. Also, they add to your application. They increase your memory footprint and your startup times. Now you might say, okay, it's 2017, my laptop is fast and has 8 gigabytes of RAM, but a lot of us host our Rails applications on Heroku. As we all know, Heroku is a very memory-constrained environment, and we've all seen the dreaded H14 errors, and then you go on debugging hunts. Reducing the number of gems greatly helps in avoiding that. Same for startup times. You don't often restart your web application, but ideally as a Rails developer, you run your tests very regularly. The longer your Rails app takes to start, the less likely you are to repeatedly run your test suite, and the less likely other developers are to actually add to it and make it even slower. I've seen this happen. You don't hesitate to add another spec to a test suite that finishes in 1 minute. But we have some project where the tests run for an hour, and God forbid, I'm not going to make that any slower. And the other problem is, all your dependencies have more dependencies. Anyone want to take a guess if you initialize a new Rails 5.1.2 app, how many gems will be in your bundle? 70, but close enough. 16 of those are explicitly listed in the gem set. Everything else is a dependency or a dependency of a dependency. So we go from 16 gems that were explicitly listed to 70. Sure, this is partially because Rails itself is split up into a lot of different gems, but it's not the only reason. Every time you add something, you introduce a liability to your code. That is not only the gem you add, it's potentially every other gem that is added by it. So this is my advice when it comes to dependencies. Be very selective about them. Don't invent everything yourself, but really look at how central is something to the core of your application, and do you really feel comfortable handing this part off to somebody else who is not you and who does not have a vested interest in your project succeeding? Generally, probably not. You should also look for actively maintained gems, because the Ruby community up until this point has been a bit fickle. People experiment, people put a lot of stuff out on GitHub, they abandon it, you're stuck with it. So you either end up forking or rewriting, and all the time savings from the beginning evaporate really fast. So I tend to use only gems for common tasks that most Rails projects will use. I use device, I use all this stuff that everybody tends to use. And I tend to use gems that come from developers that have a vested interest in the gem. So whenever you need a SaaS service, there's a good chance that the vendor itself already has provided you with a Ruby library. That's okay. But for everything else, please go on GitHub, check the open issues, check the pull requests, have a look at the code, see if that is an acceptable quality that you want to expose your own users to. And also, look that gems are maintained by more than one person, right? CanCan was a great project, but once Ryan got bored, CanCan died. So if you have gems that are maintained by whole organizations like DryRB, this is something I feel a lot more comfortable with. Even if Tim gets bored, you don't, I hope, but most people, there will be people who pick up from there and run with it, right? So let me get to the next point. This has already been covered both by Tim and Sharak. Yes, I've been practicing this for a while. I call it framework entanglement, right? This is a problem when you mix your own code with the code of your framework. To understand what I mean, I looked up 2 definitions of framework. So the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines it as a basic conceptual structure, as of ideas. And the Oxford English Dictionary has a very good definition. It's a basic structure underlying a system, concept, or text. For me, this is the key word, underlying. Unless you're a Rails core contributor, your application is not Rails. You're not selling Rails to your clients, right? You're building a business, you're building a value, you build on top of Rails. You look at it, you take what's there, you take the parts that fit you and what you expect and accept as reasonable software development practices, and you build on top of that. It's your foundation, it's not your end goal. So each part of Rails in MVC, in my opinion, serves one very specific purpose. Controllers are really not much more than an abstraction of the HTTP communication in your application. As such, they should not be considered, they should not concern themselves with your actual business logic. They should cover authentication, authorization, session and cookie handling. They should deal with your params, sanitize your input, because you always want to push this as far as possible to your application boundary and not let bad data to the inside of your app. And they should decide where to redirect you or which page to render for you. But this is really about it. Except for very, very simple CRUD actions, I have almost no code in my controllers. It all lives in service objects, is well encapsulated, and functions. A lot of the times I could probably even move them over to a Sinatra app, and a good deal of it would still work. But for me, the biggest breakthrough in my Rails controllers in the last 2 years was this article that was called How DHH Structured His Rails Controllers. Did any of you read that? So this was very interesting. DHH said that at Basecamp, each controller strictly implements the 7 standard Rails REST actions, and for everything else, they break out nested subcontrollers. So he used, I think, a mailbox or something as an example. And they don't go and write custom actions with custom routes and have an archive. Instead, they have an inbox archive controller that has a create action, which means it creates an archived version of that email. And at first, this sounds really strange. But then I figured, DHH, that guy knows a thing or two about Rails. So if he is doing it this way, that's maybe a pattern I want to copy. So I started doing that. And you know what? It works really well. First off, your routes become really clean because there's nothing custom in that. Every controller follows REST. Your APIs automatically become much saner structured because they follow REST. Another side effect is your controllers automatically stay small. You don't have dozens of actions in them. You don't have the helpers and the param sanitation that comes with them. Everything just stays a lot nicer. So I know it sounds strange at first. Go find that article. I have a link to it later. And please try it out. It was really, really changed the way I think about Rails applications. But now let's come to the most problematic part of any Rails application, the models. As he said before, if you're new to Rails, probably somebody who you respect will have told you at one point, skinny controllers, fat models. I very much agree with the first part of this advice, and I really, really disagree with the second part. Because if you start having fat models, you end up with so-called God objects. Every Rails application seems to have this one model that is absolutely impossible to change or interact with in any way that does not break unrelated parts of the application. So you talked before about 800 lines. We had a customer that started with a Rails 3 application, ported it forward to Rails 4, and now to Rails 5. They did all of that with freelancers that they hired of everywhere they could find. Eventually, we got the app. Their central model, that's called article, has 1,500 lines of code, not counting blank lines. I assume in a conservative estimate that about 20% of that code is completely dead and never gets called, but we can't quite verify that. And if you think that's bad, you should see their controllers, because some of them have dozens of actions with all their associated helpers. So whenever you try to interact with this app, things break, and they break horribly. So this is why you should be careful how much logic you put in each place. Personally, nowadays, my models become almost like active record configuration files. I put nothing in them except for association, validations, and some finders and scopes. And even there, if they become more complicated, I probably put them into a query object. And maybe I have some very simple accessor methods that wrap their database column a bit, or a very simple mutation method that toggles a Boolean field. But this is really about it. The majority of my models nowadays, they fit on one screen. They're just database configuration. So what do I do instead? I extract plain old Ruby objects, and there's various patterns for extractions. And we already heard about some of them before, but I'll still show you a bit more. So generally what I do is I build this model first, which just wraps the underlying database and is really, really minimal. Then in my app services, I create the corresponding folder, and this is where all the business logic related to that model lives. This is nice. Namespaces are a really good idea. I don't know why Ruby developers don't use them more. They separate your concerns. They give you an extra namespace so you can reuse names. I mean, we're software developers. We know the second hardest problem in computer science is naming stuff. Use namespaces, reuse the names. You can have 2 different importers. Be happy. So this is how a typical application of mine looks, right? CV in this case was a model wrapping an Elasticsearch instance. App services CV were all the related entities for moving the actual file attachments, importing them into Elasticsearch. You don't really need to care about that. The advantages, that's a bit small probably, but you end up with a single purpose object that is very easy to follow. This was CV importer. Anything you wanted to know about how a system goes from the outside world into Elasticsearch, it was right in this file. No jumping around, no callbacks, no magic. You read this top to bottom, you're done. You understand it. Another extraction pattern I started using a lot more are form objects. There's a lot of libraries nowadays for this. I wrote my own. It's called ApplicationForm to fit with Rails 5 naming conventions. We start all our apps from a common Rails template. ApplicationForm is in there. It's essentially just a small wrapper that includes some active model stuff. So it behaves mostly like a normal Rails model. So you can use all the form for and simple form that you're used to. But it's much cleaner. Why? Because some validations we only need on certain forms. We only need to validate certain data once. Why have that in the model? Why make it conditional, right? This form is for exactly one screen. It does everything I need. I don't need any validation to be conditional. The next form that does not need the validation will not include it. It's a much simpler approach, and it's much easier to get your head around. The same with this example that I stole this from the Code Climate blog because I didn't have a query object that fit on one slide. But this is the same. If you end up with very complicated database queries, go ahead, give them a name. If they're this complicated, they probably deserve a name. They deserve to be recognized as an entity of your application. Promote them to that. And one more point. This is something where I think Rails really has failed us, are views, right? Because Rails views are not views, they're templates. And that's all they do, they render templates. A lot of frameworks have a clearer separation of concerns here. They give you both a view model and a template, which means you always have a place where view-related logic goes. In Rails, this is not the case. People end up dumping everything in helpers. They're a global namespace. They get really messy. Some people think it's a great idea to implicitly rely on certain instance variables being set when you call your helpers. Madness lies down this way. Don't do it. Instead, once again, we wrote our own. It's called ApplicationView. It's about 60 lines of Ruby that wrap the forwardable module from the standard library. We explicitly forward all the calls we need. You add methods. If you're wondering where a tag helper comes from, there's no Rails magic. I include the module. I call it. You know where content tag strong came from. This is very easy conceptually to understand. And the best part is, I don't only use this to render my templates, I also use these objects in my serializers, so I don't need custom methods in my serializers, right? This is easy. This is the whole point why we are doing this, right? Because what Rails usually does is this. And this is great, right? I'm pretty sure that what most of us initially found very interesting about Rails is this whole convention over configuration approach. You take your files, you give them a certain name, you drop them in a certain location, things start happening. And you're like, whoa, that was easy. I just wrote a blog in 15 minutes. The problem is, most people do not get paid for writing blogs in 15 minutes. Most people get paid for writing businesses that need to survive years and years and years. And Tim, I'd never heard this word before, but I really like it. You said change positive applications, right? Was it change positive? That's a great term, because most Rails applications are not, because people do exactly what we talked about before. They entangle the actual application with Rails itself. That makes it hard to upgrade your dependency. It makes it hard to upgrade your Rails itself. And you get stuck. how much time have you spent moving from Rails 4 to Rails 5? And that was one of the easy upgrades. The ones of you who remember Rails 2 to Rails 3 probably still have nightmares. But the main problem I saw is once people get over Rails and they get to this like beginning intermediate status, they start realizing what all they don't know, right? At first, Rails is awesome. You do things, stuff happens. But then later you realize you're not really in control of what you're doing. You're not exactly sure, why is this happening? Why is the instance variable magically available in the view? I didn't put it there. Did you put it there? How do I know that Rails instantiated a view context for me and actually really copied this over, right? And as a software developer who gets paid for understanding and writing systems, this should bother you. It should bother you if you don't know what your code is doing. Because it becomes increasingly hard to follow the flow of the code from the entry point in your controller to the end of your application. So if anybody has seen this great talk by Rich Hickey, the inventor of Clojure, here's this talk called Simple Made Easy. If you're not aware of the distinction, easy is the opposite of hard, but simple is the opposite of complex. A lot of what Rails does is easy, and we're developers, we are lazy. We want easy stuff. The problem is, easy stuff in Rails can lead to a lot of complexity. It's easy in the short run, but it doesn't apply in all cases, right? You will have callbacks, you will conditionally ignore your callbacks, you will run into situations where you never wanted that validation to run. This is not simple, you're fighting the framework, you're not utilizing it. So I urge you, be a bit more implicit, because you're going to write your application once, you're going to read it many, many times over. If you ever come back to a client project that you haven't worked on in 6 months, you'll hate yourself for the 5-minute shortcut you took. It's really hard. I know Rails makes it really, really hard to resist the temptation to be too clever, because I think a lot of Rails itself is way too clever for its own good. But please, don't do this to yourself. You know, you deserve better. Stand up, be proud, write your own code on top of Rails, you know. Don't force your application inside it. Build on top of it. There's a great book by Avdi Grimm. It's called Objects on Rails. This is really what we're doing here, right? We're building plain old Ruby objects, easy to test, in isolation, no complicated setups, no external dependencies. They compose. This is what object-oriented programming was supposed to be about. It was not about making your code fit into some framework, right? It is about building a system. This is what we're doing. This is what you should be thinking about. You're not just writing an application. You're building a system of interacting entities. So my applications, yeah, they have a lot more classes than yours, probably. But then each class generally fits on 1 or 2 screens. It's very easy to understand. So I think to wrap it up, these are a couple of very simple tips. Before you add any gem, be selective. Think about how much it would influence your core business if this gem disappears. If it's too important, bite the bullet, write it yourself. Same with your business logic, I'm repeating myself now, but just build on top of it. Don't build inside Rails, right? Explicit, generally, is better than implicit. Because like I said, there's a big difference between how often you're going to write the piece of code and how often you're going to read it. And the next time you're going to come back, you'll be happy if it's more explicit. But always keep in mind, none of what I said is a silver bullet. There are no silver bullets in software, right? Programming is the art of consolidating interests that are inherently at conflict with each other. You manage limited resources, right? This is what programming is. Time is limited, computing resources is limited. You need to make the best of what you have in the time you have, like I hopefully did with this talk. So here's some more resources, right? The first one is this article about, well, how DHH organizes his Rails controllers. The other one from the Code Climate blog shows you 7 patterns to refactor fat active record models. And the last one is the aforementioned book by Avdi Grimm that I would, like all his writing, very much like to recommend to most Ruby and Rails developers. And that's it from me for today. Thank you.
Thanks, Mikhail. Thanks a lot. That was entertaining. You have questions for Mikhail?
Oh. better not because I have no mic anymore.
Hello.
No questions. No.
Where can you find the classes which you made application form and
So we are hiring, and if you start working for us, you will find them.
hello?
No, I plan to extract them eventually.